It is my great honor to welcome Ralph Nader, renowned and tireless public advocate, former presidential candidate, and author of the recent book, Unstoppable, The Emerging Left-Right Alliance to Dismantle the Corporate State, here to the Soapbox on WMPG. Welcome, Mr. Nader.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to get to talk about this emerging left-right alliance that you write about in your most recent book. But before we get there, I want to sort of kind of set the stage and ask you some broader questions about the political state of America at this point. It's abundantly clear to anyone paying any attention that America is in a very difficult state economically. The middle class have been hit particularly hard by the recent recession. And when it comes to approaches to sort of address these problems and issues that have arisen, there is this spectrum that seems to be emerging. There is sort of the deregulatory, anti-tax, pro-corporate movement that is probably best equated with the right or neoliberalism. And then you've got people like Robert Reich, who are essentially advocating what would almost be called a sequel to the New Deal, where the government would be government forces would be realigned. We would re-regulate the economy and redistribute wealth more equitably. And then you've got people like Dr. Richard D. Wolff, a Marxist economist, who essentially argues that no, we've got to do something bigger and a more systemic change, and essentially introduce democracy into the workplace and reshape our economy in a more democratic and essentially more socialist way, such as through workers-owned cooperatives and worker self-directed enterprise. So where would you identify on this spectrum, or do you occupy a different place that I haven't mentioned?
Well, I'm very focused on how easy it is to turn the country around. Once people realize that they need to do their homework and not vote for politicians who then betray them, politicians whose silver tongue flatters them, and then when they get elected, the politicians obey their corporate paymasters. That's the first thing that's needed. Once we get a Congress and a state legislature around our country representing pretty modest necessities of the American people, the following will happen very quickly. One, we'll get a restoration of the minimum wage, at least to $10.90 or $11 an hour, which is what it was in 1968, adjusted for inflation. We'll get full Medicare for all, everybody in, nobody out, very simple, very efficient, no complex billings, no denials of care, no discrimination, no profiteering by the health insurance companies and the drug companies, everybody in, nobody out, free choice of doctor and hospital, which people mostly don't have today under these group or HMO plans. Third thing we'll get is a crackdown on corporate crime that's ripping off consumers, endangering workers, abandoning workers with these corporate managed trade agreements abroad, and in a whole variety of ways, shifting the burdens onto the smaller taxpayers from the tax scams and escapees and shelters that the big corporations and the super wealthy have been able to get through Congress and state legislatures. And fourth, we'll see a redirection of the huge public budgets from being given to corporate welfare or crony capitalism outlets like subsidies, handouts, giveaways, special controls over our public lands and natural resources, as well as bailouts of Wall Street and other corporations who have crashed the economy on the backs of the small taxpayer and the workers. Now, that money and pulling back from empire abroad and the criminal wars of aggression that are just getting people organized more and more against the U.S. all over the world. Look at the way al-Qaeda and its offshoots have metastasized from eastern Afghanistan into dozens of countries now. Once that money is brought back, we can rebuild the public works of our country. All those bridges, highways, clinics, libraries, sewage water systems in Maine and all over the country that need repair, and public transit. So you see, it's not that difficult. And all these measures I've just mentioned have huge majoritarian left-right support. Mm-hmm. It's just a matter of the proverbial leverage by the voters. They decide they're going to turn out the corporatists in the legislatures, put in people who don't forget where they come from, have term limits, and have citizen legislatures to do the right thing. So we're not asking for pie in the sky. People want these things. They need these things for themselves and their children and grandchildren and for the benefit of their country.
So you strike me as someone who is a firm believer in democracy and the democratic system. Perhaps you're familiar with the study that recently came out of Princeton that suggests that citizens have a near zero influence on legislative acts in government. And in fact, the government caters, as you know, is no big surprise, to wealthy corporate interests, substantially greater than they pay attention to the needs and wants of the average citizen. So explain to me how this left-right alliance that you're describing could help address this iniquity in government.
Well, I mean, the reason why the few rich and corporate dominate our country is because they work at it. It's not just that they're wealthy. They work at it. They lobby. They've got swarms of lobbyists. They put their people in high government positions. They challenge good people in government in primaries, try to ease them out. So let's get down to business here. If the people don't show up, the people's interests are going to be overwhelmed and ignored. So if half the people don't vote, the other half trudge to the polls and vote for the least worst of the two corporate parties who are dialing for the same commercial campaign cash. What do you expect is going to happen? And so in this book, Unstoppable, I give a lot of examples of when the people of this country bestir themselves, and by that I mean just 1% or so of the citizens challenging the power structure and pushing for change that is supported more silently by a majority of the American people. That's an unstoppable combination. And again, I've seen in Washington firsthand, by no means as many times as we would all like, when the people bestir themselves, that is, when there's maybe 1% of opinion reflected and focused on senators and representatives, and they know it represents a larger majority of opinion back home, it's over for the corporate interests. I've seen it happen with the whistleblower protection bill that challenged corporate fraud on the government. I've seen it happen with the auto safety bill many years ago. So when I say it's easier than you think, I'm talking about 1% of the people on any given issue with a majority behind them can take down the corporate power structure and make them behave, make them adjust to a new realm of justice. And they're very good at adjusting when the law is read to them, these corporations. When they see no way that they can corrupt, sidestep, evade, escape, they'll obey. And that's what we need. Law and order for corporate crime, fraud, and abuse. No more corporate welfare, crony capitalism. No more profiteering and encouraging wars of aggression as part of the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about in his farewell address. No more abandoning this country with the encouragement of the tax laws, shipping jobs and whole industries to fascist and communist regimes abroad who know how to keep their workers in their place at 80 cents an hour. You know, it's just like years ago, the corporations in the early Industrial Revolution hired 8, 9, 10-year-old children and put them in dungeon factories. Well, it took a while, but when the people bestirred themselves, no more child labor, guess what? The companies started hiring their parents or their adults. The same with environmental, the same with Social Security, the same with consumer product safety. People have to realize that they're their own enemy if they just go day after day wallowing in their powerlessness. Then they're powerless. If they go day after day saying you can't fight City Hall, I can't take on Exxon, I'm just going to live in a private life, try to get through each day, then they're going to be rolled. They're going to be disrespected. They're going to be excluded. So test it out, folks. You get 1% in your town of active citizens, and they reflect majority of opinion, and there's a needed change in that town, you'll get it.
So what would you suggest are sort of effective messages to mobilize a populist movement such as you're describing, especially given that the recent economic downturn and mass unemployment and increased corporatism haven't themselves been enough to sort of instigate a broad movement? Or am I misreading that? Is there one?
No, there isn't. I mean, there's sporadic efforts. You see them on Occupy Wall Street and the activities under that rubric around the country. That's pretty much dissipated now. You see on the right the Tea Party. But in my book, Unstoppable, the unstoppable political force is when you take issues that left, right agree on and not allow themselves to be divided and ruled and just focused on the issues they disagree on. You get them on what they agree on. There's a 70-80% support for restoring the minimum wage. There is a huge support for breaking up the big New York banks that are too big to fail and are ready to crash the economy again. Mm-hmm. There's a huge support to get rid of the NAFTA and World Trade Organization pull-down trade agreements on American standard of living. There's a huge support for cracking down on corporate crime. And there's even a majority support, even though it's not on the table of any politicians except maybe Bernie Sanders from Vermont, for full Medicare for everybody in, nobody out, free choice of doctor and hospital. But you see, the ruling structure divides left-right. They focus them on the areas that left-right disagree on, like reproductive rights, constitutionally imposed balanced budget, school prayer, gun control, etc. And that's the way they divide and rule. But on many other areas outlined in my book, I give 25 areas where there's a left-right support. And it starts with public opinion, and then it becomes more organized at the local level. They start getting media. They start getting the attention of the elected officials, state, local, and federal. Pretty soon the elected officials start discussing it. That's what we call putting these issues on the table. And you're on your way to victory. That's what's going to happen now with the minimum wage. Congress is feeling the heat from back home, left, right, and cities and towns are not even waiting for Congress in many places. They're passing higher minimum wage. This is what's beginning to happen against the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, which is like NAFTA on steroids. Very bad for our country, very good for global corporations. Mm-hmm. And that is going to be stopped by a left-right alliance in the House of Representatives in defiance of their own leaders, Speaker Boehner and Minority Leader Pelosi. So at the state level, we've seen now in the last 2 years 15 state legislatures passing juvenile justice reform, shortening these crazy long jail sentences for youngsters caught with some drugs in their possession. That could only happen with left-right legislators banding together to get these bills through. So it's happening. I want people to read this book, short book, historical, contemporary, projective for the future. It will hopefully persuade you that it's easier than you think to turn this country around. You can start with your left-right neighbors in your own living room and just say, okay, we know what we disagree on. That's what we've been doing all these years. Now let's shift to the areas where we agree on, and we haven't been doing anything over the years.
Something we talk about often on the show actually is very similar to what you're describing, which is that this left-right binary, the Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal, to me seems a little disingenuous and not terribly accurate. It seems that we all, I mean, I'm speaking from down here as a working person, seems that we all want basically the same things. We want to be able to live a life of dignity. We want to be able to provide for our family and our friends. We want to have safe and sustainable communities. And it seems the left-right binary is something that is used as sort of a cudgel to keep people distracted and divided.
It's a controlling process. It's worked for 2,000 years or more. There's nothing new about this. Concentrated power in the hands of few against the many is facilitated by the divide and rule strategy. It's not the only strategy, but in this country it's extremely prominent, and we've got to recognize it for what it is. It's to weaken a left-right alliance on one issue after another. They got these corporations bypassing, undermining parental authority, marketing junk food, junk drink, violent programming to 6, 7, 8, 9-year-olds. I mean, who would permit that? That comes in over 90%. Eminent domain, where the corporations like Pfizer in New London get together with the city to condemn a whole housing neighborhood of families and raise the neighborhood to give it to Pfizer for expanded headquarters. And then they quit New Haven after the destruction occurred. How many people you think would support that kind of outrage? So we got to really get going here. That the country can turn around very fast. All this stuff about gridlock and polarization, that's true when you don't open up the arenas of convergence and cooperation and alliance. That's what's off the table. It's off the media. And people who don't read about it or see it on TV, you know, they get discouraged and they wallow in their hopelessness. So this book is designed to turn all that around. It can be much more quickly than you would ever dream of. I remember in the 60s in Congress, we would get legislation in a matter of months and it would be implemented. Auto safety legislation, product safety legislation, air and water pollution regulation. And you didn't have this nonsense of, paralysis and gridlock and all this. Gridlock serves the interests of the power structure. There's no gridlock for what corporations want through Congress, like tax loopholes and subsidies. That goes through. There's no gridlock on that. There's a gridlock because both parties have turned their back in varying degrees on the American people in return for their sinecures and their campaign cash.
So, Ralph, I wonder how you would explain something like the passage of the Affordable Care Act in the form that it ultimately took, when, in fact, you did have a left-right coalition among average Americans that were that was significantly in favor of, at the very least, a public option, public not-for-profit option, if not full Medicare for all. And yet what ultimately was passed had absolutely no resemblance to that. So how do we... Yeah, go ahead.
Because there was no organization out there. The polls show what you said, Eric, but there was no organization taking the public opinion operationally and saying to the legislators when they come back home, hey, why aren't you talking about full Medicare for all? It's the most efficient. You know, you have free choice of doctor and hospital, and it's half the price per capita. Other countries do it. They have better medical outcomes at half the price per capita. We're the most expensive in the world. So, you see, it was opinion that didn't go operational. Because, you know, Obama took it off the table. The Republicans obviously took it off the table. There's nothing to cling to. So you have to have this left-right opinions move to stage 2, stage 3, where they force it on the table of these politicians. Once that happens, the media starts covering it. Once that happens, people get a higher morale that it can get done.
So I think I'm interested also in your perspective on the demise of real forces on the left in this country. It seems like in the 60s and in the 30s and 40s that there were these forces, whether they were unions or a stronger socialist party. Why is it that we find ourselves in this situation where there are no mass organizations to really speak for or represent the interests of working people?
Because all the people on the progressive liberal side, like the labor unions, the liberal intelligentsia, the publications, they're all playing defense. If you get fundraisers, you get fundraisers from Democrats, Eric, in the mail.
If I do, I throw them out, I'm afraid.
Yeah, well, if you open them, you will see. See, I'm holding one now from the Democratic National Headquarters. And here's the appeal. Yes, Leader Pelosi, I will help protect the medical guarantee from Republican plans to abolish it for our seniors.
Mm.
See how defense it is? It isn't, yes, Leader Pelosi, I will join the national movement already supported by majority opinion for full Medicare for all, everybody in, nobody out, free choice of doctor and hospital, more efficient with better medical outcomes. So once you play defense, the other side automatically is on the offense. And once you play defense, you're always going to lose.
So it seems increasingly like the two-party system that we have, both parties are serving similar, if not the same, interests. And so the Democratic Party, which used to much more effectively at some times in the history of the country represent the interests of working people, seems to have ceded that battle and is content to just play defense. So is it your sense that we need a viable third party? Is this something that is even possible in this country?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in Maine, for example, independent candidates have won. Third parties have gotten on the first round, a decent turnout. Sure, we need competition. Competition means more parties, more agendas, more candidates to give you choice on the ballot when you go to vote. Simple. The other thing that's needed is to stop wailing about the Koch brothers. Sure, expose them. But, all these appeals that you see, the Nation magazine, the Progressive, it's the Koch brothers, it's the Koch brothers. My answer to that is, okay, keep exposing the Koch brothers, but you got to go further than that. Otherwise, you're just wailing the inevitable, because the Koch brothers are not going to be bothered by you, and they're worth $80 billion and willing to spend a lot of it. They're not going to be bothered by you. What they're going to be bothered by are people who, primary incumbents, like David Bratt, let's say. All right, David Bratt beat Eric Cantor. Maybe he took some money from the Koch brothers, right? But he beat him on the crony capitalism. If he gets elected and he betrays his opposition to crony capitalism, someone's going to come along and beat him in the primary. But he said something very important on Fox News the night he won the other day, that liberals and progressives are wise to heed. And that is, he said, money doesn't vote, voters vote. Why is that wise to heed? Because what liberals and progressives who are active have got to go, they've got to go from exposing big money to rolling up their sleeves in neighborhood after neighborhood and mobilizing the vote around candidates of their choice. Democracy requires work. Otherwise, it's just talk. The only place where democracy comes before work, Eric, is in the dictionary.
I like also what I've heard you say before, which is that essentially if people were to make activism a hobby, like bowling or like painting or whatever it is on the side of their job.
Watching.
Yeah, bird watching. That could be a way to bring about real force in democratic politics.
Exactly. Over 1% of the people in this country are dedicated bird watchers. Not 1/100th of 1% of people in this country are as dedicated Congress watchers. I love people who watch birds. We want to preserve the birds, listen to their beautiful songs, see their role in the ecosystem. But Congress takes 22% of your income. It can send your children off to war by abdication or worse. It can allow you to pay more taxes so that the rich that grease their campaigns in Washington can pay less. It cannot enforce the laws and expose you to toxic chemicals in the air, water, in the food. Isn't it worth as much effort to watch Congress in one congressional district after another, linked among yourselves, as it is to watch birds?
I agree 100%. So let me just jump back a little bit to the point you were making about the Koch brothers and the wealthy. You wrote a book, Only the Rich Can Save Us, and your current book, Unstoppable, features a chapter entitled Dear Billionaire. Frederick Douglass has said that power concedes nothing without a demand. Can we really expect that the wealthy will somehow have a come to Jesus moment here where they recognize that their fates are entwined with those of the rest of us and rely on them to be able to do something to save the system? Or do we need to mobilize a force that has the power to demand it and back up that demand?
First of all, justice needs money. Historically, rich Bostonians and New Yorkers helped fund the abolition of slavery movement in the 19th century. Rich people helped fund the women's suffrage movement for women's right to vote in the 19th century. The early environmental movements were funded by well-to-do people. The early civil rights movements in the 50s and early 60s were funded by two rich families, the Stern family and the Curry family, for example. All right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's not be pie in the sky here. Justice movements require expenses, transportation expenses, communication expenses, full-time organizers in the field, etc. Give me 1% of the billionaires with enlightened backgrounds, and there is at least 1% of the billionaires with enlightened backgrounds, especially when they go into their 70s, 80s, 90s, they have a different perspective on life, and they're concerned with posterity, their children, grandchildren. Give me 1% of the billionaires taking on the other 99%, and they're going to win, the 1%, because they have the public sentiment behind them, they have the evidence behind them, and they're able to get the media to the people because of their wealth. It'll be a slam dunk defeat for the 99%. What will happen to them? They'll either have to obey the laws, adjust their greed to the overriding necessities of the people, or they will lose out completely. There will be violators of the law, and they will be subject to the enforcement of the law. Which do you think they're going to choose? The rich and powerful are very expedient. They often don't have principles, which means they're very opportunistic, and when they see an irresistible populist force, grounded in evidence, graced in irresistible rhetoric, they will comply. We have examples in American history where that's happened. So it's easier than you think, folks, but you got to get 1% real active as bird watchers, dedicated bird watchers, and you'll see this country turn around. If you want further persuasion, read my book, Unstoppable, The Left-Right Alliance to Dismantle the Corporate State.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Nader, for being here, and I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to personally thank you for everything you have done in your life for this country. I'm speaking for myself and a lot of people who I know who would love the opportunity to thank you from the bottom of their hearts for what you've done. So thank you so much.
Well, thank the people who supported us, Eric, and if you want my column every week free to keep the flame alive and keep the dynamism going, just go to nader.org, and sign up for my weekly column.
Will do. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.
You're welcome.